Abdul Masih al-Antaqi, a Christian editor of the Egyptian magazine Al-Amran, says, "It cannot be denied that Ali was the Imam of speakers, the leader of speakers and orators, and he was the teacher and the leader of writers and philosophers." Our next speaker is the Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History at the University of Exeter. Professor Sajjad H. Rizvi will be sharing with us his thoughts on the philosophical arguments in Nahjul Balagha. Professor Rizvi has achieved a comprehensive collection of academic qualifications covering modern history, Middle Eastern studies, and philosophy. These include a PhD with a doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of existence in the thought of the Iranian Safavid philosopher Mullah Sadra Shirazi. Please welcome Professor Rizvi with a loud Nare Salawat.
It's rather dark here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm starting in the name of God, the merciful, the font of mercy, the giver of mercy. Praise is God's, as is his due, and we can never ultimately give him his due. And peace and blessings are with Muhammad and his progeny, everlasting without end, again, as we can never give them their due. I don't, unlike my predecessors, I do not have a polished paper. So I'll be upfront and say I'm going to wing it. But the reason why I did accept Maulana Alvi's invitation when it came was because I recognized that it would be a privilege to speak here. Anything associated with the Imam is a privilege, just like it is your privilege to be here. The organizers should not feel the need to thank you for coming. It's your privilege to have come in the first place. And I congratulate you on staying so far. And it's a privilege because the kalam of the Imam is something very important. As he himself says in the Nahj at one place, Nahnu umara al-kalam. We are the emirs of kalam. And I won't even try and translate kalam as speech, because speech would not, again, render the variety of nuances that the term has. And so one feels a certain element of awe, of hayra, in fact, in front of the word. And a less foolish person than me would perhaps have gone with Wittgenstein and said, well, of that which we cannot know, perhaps we should stay silent. But as I said, I'm a bit more foolish than that, so I will try and say a few things. Before I come to philosophy, just one further word. I'm really very grateful actually to Maulana Alvi and those who have really insisted that we have something on the Nahjul Balagha, because the Nahj in many ways is a text which is mazloom. There's no doubt about it. We don't pay enough attention to it, and it's in many ways surprising. Because if people, for example, ask us who we are, we say we are Shiat Ali, and so then the obvious response then is, well, who is Ali? So how do we answer that? Well, a very simple thing would be, he is the person who spoke these words, and we can present it. But the fact is, we cannot present it because we don't even know what it is to begin with. It is mazloom. And an element of that mazloomiyya is the fact that my own copy of the Nahj, which I brought with me and which I will present some things from, has, to my shame, been lying on my shelf for at least 2 years without having been picked up. So it's, I think this is probably quite a common occurrence around communities, that even if we do have the text, it's a bit like the Quran in that sense. We keep it in a nice place. We very rarely open it. And even if we open it, we do not really make the effort to understand it And that understanding, that lack of understanding, is partly exacerbated by the fact that we who are not those who speak Arabic, we are the people who are not of Arabic, do not have access to the text in any useful and particularly reliable manner. You're all familiar with the fact that the English translations are hopeless, to be perfectly honest. And I can also say, and people might disagree with me, but the Urdu translations are equally hopeless. So we have a problem. We have a huge problem, and I'm very grateful for the work of Maulana Alvi to really try and deal with that problem of how do we then bring this text forward so that if someone asks us who we are and we say Shia Ali, and we say, yes, this is Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And that's a fundamental responsibility that we do have. Now, with respect to philosophy, there are lots of problems with raising the question of philosophy in the Nahj. At one level, it's not a problem at all. For those of you who are familiar will know Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli has a very good pet book which is called Hikmat Nazari wa Amali, the Nahjul Balagha. So he's already written a book on this, and for those of you who are interested, you can go off and just read it. But that is within a particular context of what we understand by philosophy. Fundamentally, the problem is if I talk about philosophy in the Nahj, there are two types of objections or two types of sets of objections which could be raised. One, for example, would be from those who are interested in philosophy, and they would, if we then presented some of these texts, would not really understand what it was. Because philosophy as an academic discipline, particularly in the Anglo-American world, has very little to do with most of the concerns which are presented in the khutbahs, the letters, and the sayings. Philosophy, although it, of course it's improving to a certain extent, but broadly speaking, after what's known as a linguistic turn, most philosophers have been rather obsessed with the language and with very narrow understandings of what language and meaning can pertain to, so much so that one sometimes gets the impression that they don't really think there is anything outside of language. It's purely linguistic analysis. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be negative all the way, but it does mean that it's limited what we understand by philosophy dramatically. And so if we present something which talks about the nature of God, which talks about the nature of humanity, tries to understand what we are, where we have come from, where we are going, these fundamental questions of the Alpha and the Omega, the fundamental questions of the Al-Mabda wal-Ma'ad, the fundamental questions of whence, what, who, whither. These are all like actually, this phrase of wisdom, philosophy is about where we're coming from, what we are, where we're going, is actually a paraphrase of a very famous saying of Imam Ali. Doesn't arise, and it seems a bit strange. And then we can then ask this question, well, if we are describing this as philosophy and we're presenting it to an audience interested in philosophy, why are we doing that? Now, of course, we know in European culture, philosophy has a privileged status. It is considered very much, still to a large extent, although increasingly you could argue science is displacing it, as the most important discipline. It's the most important intellectual inquiry. It is something which basically, going back to Aristotle, establishes the framework for how we inquire into everything. Everything, what we can see, what we cannot see, what we can feel, what we can analyze, categories, and so forth. But at the same time, if we define something as philosophy, are we doing justice to it if that initial work does not itself define itself as philosophy? If we call, for example, Imam Ali as a philosopher, are we not diminishing him by doing that? Because we're placing him in a certain category which allows him to be kind of sealed off in a particular way and addresses a particular type of audience. But it is a diminishing, it is a confinement, it's a restriction of what the Imam is, because we have to always remember, one of the other reasons why this text is important, because the Imam is the Lisanullah. He is the tongue of God. This is, in a sense, divine speech. It is not kalamullah in the sense of the Quran, but it's still divine speech because it is the manifestation of the divine who is speaking. It is the lisanullah, it is the wajhullah who is speaking. And if one does not, obviously as a believer, one has a certain attitude towards that. Others may not. Coming from the other side, there is also a problem if I define the contents of the Nahj as philosophy. And that is a objection which comes from within us. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the tendencies that are around which are quite hostile to the concept of falsafa or the concept of hikmah as a particular type of discipline. Philosophy is seen as something which is extrinsic to the Muslim tradition. It's something which comes from outside. It's Greek. It's part of a conspiracy. It's something which is about forcing Muslims to subject to modes of thought which are outside of their tradition. It's a type of intoxication and infatuation of something which is inauthentic. Now, increasingly, this is becoming quite an important tendency. It's also a tendency which you find in the Hawzain, which the ulama here will be familiar with. And there are different ways I can respond to that. The most obvious way I can respond to that is by saying that when I'm talking about philosophy, I'm talking about hikmah, I'm not talking about falsafa. And most of the philosophers in the Islamic tradition, and I'll mention one a bit later, the obvious one, Mullah Sadwa, and how can I not talk about Mullah Sadwa, since I work on him, they are interested in hikmah. And for them, hikmah is not something which is extrinsic to the tradition. For them, hikmah is something which is deeply embedded in the revelation itself. They, for example, start with the fact that hikmah is a Quranic word. It is mentioned in the Quran. They quote the very famous verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, يُؤْتَى الْحِكْمَةَ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. He gives wisdom, he gives hikmah, he gives philosophy, perhaps, if you want, to whoever he wills. And whoever has been given it has been given a great good, khayran kathira. Something which is a good, which is greatly good, it's abundantly good. There's a concept of abundance. So this is something which is divinely bestowed. This is precisely what the hukama actually understand by this word. And then, of course, there are very many hadith precisely which mention hikmah. There's, for example, hikmatu dalatul mu'min. Hikmah is the lost property, if you will. It's a rather simplistic translation, but we'll go with that at the moment. The lost property of the believer. Or even more salient, which brings us back to the Imam, is the famous saying, which you are all familiar with. One sort of variant of it is, أَنَا مَدِينَةُ الْحِكْمَةِ وَعَلِيٌّ بَابُهَا. You're all familiar with this saying, but you're probably familiar with ilm being used instead of hikmah. So this is something which is very much embedded in it. And if you read the works on hikmah by someone like Mullah Sadwa, they place it right at the front. This is precisely what we're doing. We're not doing something extrinsic to the tradition. We're not doing something extrinsic to the revelation, but we are trying to bring out the ultimate truths and claims about the nature of reality, about the nature of what it means to be human from within the text itself, from within the divine speech itself. And this is absolutely essential. Now, one further way I'm going to try and gloss this, I'll give you a definition of hikmah, which I think can then lead us to the text, and I should probably move rapidly onto the text. Is that the definitions that someone like Mullah Sadwa gives for hikmah are about the perfection of the human self. But it's about the perfection of the human self in particular ways. For example, that perfection lies through the ability to construct arguments, the ability to construct conclusive and demonstrative arguments, as it is in the Ash'ari tradition. To understand things without having to have recourse to authority, without taqleed, as it says. And we know that all of us pay lip service to the fact that we don't believe in taqleed in matters of faith and reality, and yet none of us actually practice this in reality. But that's a different game. That's a different argument for another time. And what is the function of this? Where are we going with the perfection of this self to understand? It is so that our self, our intellect, the identity of what we are, can become a alim, can become someone who knows, but can also, in a sense, become an alim, can become a rational order, so that we can understand the rational order within and without ourselves. So that we can understand reality, so to speak, from a divine or God's perspective, a divine perspective. And because the very notion is that the divine has created the world in such a way, with a certain wise purpose, that everything is ordered, everything is arranged. And so we can understand that arrangement. We can understand how things relate to each other. We can understand how humans are related to each other. We can understand what role animals have. We can understand the environment around us. And then that basic understanding leads to important ethical commitments for what we do. Because knowledge is never something passive. It's not, okay, we understand what reality is, fine, that's interesting. But rather, it's knowing that then impels us to act in a particular way, so that we understand where things are in place and we give them their due. So we do not practice dhulm in that very simple sense. The second aspect of the definition, which I think is very important, is one tendency which actually is happening in contemporary philosophy, which is to argue that philosophy is not something which is purely abstract. But rather, when we're practicing philosophy, we're doing something. We're actually living in a particular way, where we have ethical commitments. We don't just have commitments to ways of thought. So hikmah, for example, is a way of life. It's not just about the use of the aql in a simple sense of the word reason, but rather it's the idea that the aql is an expression of the self, and there are various other expressions of the self which allow understanding to flourish. And these other expressions of the self we call spiritual exercises, which was mentioned earlier. So the fact that we sit in a particular way, the fact that we perform certain practices, we invoke the name of God, we train ourselves to live in a particular way. These are all things which assist understanding. Because what we do understand is that humans fundamentally are not kind of disembodied selves. Humans are not floating around independently of each other, but rather humans are very much connected. We're connected, we live in society, we live in communities. So our understanding of who we are and our reality has to similarly be connected in that particular way. We have to live it. We can't just articulate certain ideas and leave it at that. And so that means that we have to understand the communal setting, and we also have to understand that the inculcation of philosophical practice has to have someone who teaches you. You have to have a sage who does it. And ultimately, for the tradition, the ultimate sage, the ultimate hakim in that sense, who teaches us, is the Imam. It's really as simple as that. So you have a complete circle of meaning, in which individuals are located, in which they're trying to train their minds to think in particular ways, to understand reality, to practice, understand their engagement, but fundamentally guided by the fact that there is a sage who has done it, who's been there, so to speak, understands it. You read the text, it's obvious he understands it. He totally understands it. The famous saying which was mentioned before, even Loko Shafil Ghata Lamazdatu Yakina. Even if the veil were pulled apart so that I would literally see reality, it wouldn't make any effort, it wouldn't make any difference on the complete certainty that I have about reality itself. Now, I'm going to very rapidly then look at two texts, two very simple, well, not simple actually, two rather important texts which will already be familiar to you. One of them I think has already been cited at least twice. The first text is, of course, the very first khutbah of the Nahjul Balagha. It's very famous, and again, for those of you who are lazy like me, first khutbah, it's a no-brainer. You open the book, it's where it starts. It's very, very easy. Go to the first khutbah. And the first khutbah is famous also because it's quite comprehensive. It gives you an explanation from the beginning with respect to what is faith, what is God, takes you through the process of creation, takes you to the creation of Adam, takes you to the prophets, to our prophet in particular, and from that then goes on and culminates in some, and in the Quran, of course, the expression of the Prophet, and culminates with a passage on the Hajj. And one of the reasons why I picked it, apart from the fact that I'm lazy, is the fact that we're coming up to Hajj. And this sermon culminates in Hajj. Now, a lot of people looking at this khutbah would say, this is really strange. You know, the Imam is talking about God, he's talking about the prophets, he's talking about the Quran, etc. And then he just has these lines on Hajj. Well, why? It doesn't seem to be obviously connected in any sort. He's not mentioning any other ritual practices which are incumbent. But there is, I think, an obvious scheme here at work, in the sense that the Hajj is the culmination of this, because the Hajj is the preparation for the return. What this khutbah is doing in its entirety is explaining where we come from, what we are, how are we relating to that reality from which we come, and then how do we return. And the fundamental step in that return precisely is the Hajj. And there's two ways he does it. One is by alluding to the obvious fact that the Hajj is this preparation for the final meeting. It's the miqat, which prefigures the miqat, where we will ultimately be meeting God in the afterlife. But also because we are, through our act of Hajj, through our reversion, we are also expressing a conscious and volitional act of returning to God. And we're doing that by imitating the practice of the angels. For example, in that passage, he says that, you know, the reason why we do tawaf is because the angels do tawaf of the arsh. Very, very simple idea. But that's precisely, by doing that, we are imitating the angels. So we are imitating those who are entirely in concordance with the divine will. Because that's what we want. That's the rida that we seek. Someone was talking about the spiritual path before. One of the fundamental steps, if arguably the ultimate step, of course, in the spiritual path is this rida. The fact that you have the will, the contentment of the divine. And that's what you want to be doing here. So there's lots of other things, and I can't even begin to touch on this. I was thinking earlier that with most of these khutbahs, they're of course voluminous commentaries, but you could easily write volumes just on why it's called Nahjul Balagha. You could easily write volumes on the famous passage, which I will have a look at briefly. It's really dark. أول الدين معرفته, right? What does the who refer to? What is who? This is a very, very simple, like really profound and problematic thing in itself. Before you get to the question of ma'rifah, what is who? Who is who? So, thank you. Although I couldn't see how many minutes it said. I'm assuming I know, yeah. So there are these very important elements in the khutbah, and that passage is very famous. The beginning of faith, the commencement on the path, is to understand himself. But here the awwal, I don't think, is necessarily just the beginning, it's also the culmination. I mean, to say that you can only really have faith if you have the ma'rifah of God is being really harsh on us. Because most of us, frankly, do not have the ma'rifah of God. We have no idea what that even means. So awwal, in the sense of the ultimate of the faith is this. And then it goes, in the kamalu ma'rifati tasdiqu bihi. And this is a very, very famous passage. What does it mean to affirm him? What does the affirmation mean? It's relating to tawheed. What does the tawheed mean? Meaning you have to sincerely and selflessly give for him, to be, actually sincerely be for him, exist for him. And then it goes on to what that means, negation of attributes to him. And this is not attributes in a simple sense. I mean, sometimes people say, well, what this means is, this is classic Mu'tazili theology, these attributes, mercy, wrath, etc., these are not real. Actually, something which is, in some ways, I think much more sensible and simple is being said here, which is that any sincerity, any purity of belief in God has to recognize that the language we use for God is completely impoverished. We, for example, may say that God has mercy, right? And when we say this often because the Quran says so, but we have no understanding of what that means because we understand what humans understand by mercy, and that's it. And there's a limit to that. So the negation of attributes means ultimately the negation of language, so much so that one cannot say anything before God except silence. And it's as simple as that. And all we do in our kind of rather humble ways is to try and make sense of that. Brings me back to the famous definition of Mullah Sadra. One of the things he says is that this endeavor is hasbat taqat al-bashariyya. It's only insofar as humans can possibly do it. And humans are of different types, and humans have different istita'as and taqas with respect to this. But the ultimate human, the insan kamil, and Rebecca mentioned this before, it's all about becoming human, and we can only become human if we know what a human is. And we know what a human is because we like to think we know what Ali ibn Abi Talib is. And the way we know it is through the Nahj. I was going to mention another khutbah. The one I actually picked was 110 because, of course, it's Ya Ali. But you can go off and read that yourself. You've got to do some homework. The other one I'll just quickly mention, have a look at 152 as well. Anyway, as I said, it's your privilege to be here. Thank you for sticking with it, and thank you for bearing with me.